We're going to begin chapter 13, which is on the juvenile court process. In this section, we're going to walk through the stages of the juvenile court process. We will discuss who's involved, who are the players in the courtroom, and we're going to discuss the key issues of the pre-adjudication stage and the pros and cons of transferring youths and their cases to adult court, reviewing the trial process as a whole, and then finally the types of punishments or dispositions a juvenile offender faces. So let's begin with the juvenile court and its jurisdiction. So what is the jurisdiction of the juvenile court? First, what is jurisdiction? It's a court's authority to act or to have the power to handle a particular case. Generally, the designated juvenile court has jurisdiction over all acts of delinquency committed by a juvenile, delinquent, or offender. And those terms, juvenile delinquent, juvenile offender, those terms are interchangeable. In New York, they have different meanings depending on the age of the individual. Chapter 1 kind of discussed this, and the link there, you can see the link under chapter 1 for ages, but for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to use juvenile delinquent unless I need to specify differently. So jurisdiction over juveniles and their delinquent acts, and that's family court that has jurisdiction over these juveniles and delinquent acts. Not traffic court, not a civil court. They wouldn't have the ability to hear such a case because the law, the legislators in the state gave the power to family court in New York and in most jurisdictions. That's who overhears it. However, in bigger areas, there might be several judges in family court and one judge is specifically assigned to hear juvenile matters. It is an independent juvenile court, and it's specialized for children. The goal is to promote rehabilitation and ensures procedural due process, i.e. the fairness in court. The court acts both in the interest of the child and in the best interest of public protection. And this is what a court considers in making its decisions. First, the best interest of the child. How a case flows, we'll get to the specific details, but let's talk about the cases in court generally, or what has been in court generally over the years. In 2011, approximately 1.236 million delinquent cases were referred to juvenile court nationwide, and this has been a decrease from the last report, which was done in 1997. The statistics show gender and race differences do exist. 72% of these juvenile cases involve males and 19% involve females. However, with females, there was a showing that they are being processed for delinquent acts more so now, or it's on the rise over the last years. And we also saw some race differences with the cases. 33% involved African American youth. So who are the players in the juvenile courtroom? The juvenile court is composed of several individuals who make decisions on what to do with cases involving delinquents and the status offenders. And our first one we're going to start with is the defense attorney. As discussed in a previous chapter, juveniles have the right to counsel at trials. And this includes not just the trials, but every stage of a case where a delinquent act or criminal charge has been formally brought. And we'll talk about the difference between formally and informally. However, states are free to extend this right to other areas, including at any point a juvenile faces incarceration. And in New York, juvenile has a right to an attorney in any proceeding in the court system. And the defense attorney isn't technically called a defense attorney. They're called a law guardian. And we'll talk a little bit more about a law guardian in a moment when I get to guardian ad litem. But in a juvenile delinquent case, the attorney who's representing the child isn't referred to as the defense attorney. They're referred to as the law guardian. So courts must provide counsel to youth who can't afford counsel, indigent youth who face the possibility of incarceration. The role of the attorney is to help clarify, there's a number of roles, but generally to help clarify jurisdictional problems. Maybe this case isn't going to be in family court. Decide if there is sufficient evidence to file a formal petition. They'll look at the documentations, see if what the charges say or what the acts are involved. They'll outline a position for the juvenile. They'll explore informal adjustment opportunities, i.e. possibly through plea bargaining or maybe a resolution before it gets to juvenile court. They play a critical role in the disposition, like what could happen in the end. We'll talk about disposition. And they're also tasked with the job of pursuing any appeal that the juvenile might have at the end of a juvenile court proceeding. In essence, the job is to ensure that the rights of the juvenile are not violated during the juvenile justice process. And juveniles can retain their own attorney, or they may have one represent them through a court appointment. And sadly, despite this rule, less than half of juveniles accused of delinquency do not receive the assistance of counsel, or less than half of them receive counsel, which gives us more than half do not. So, and that's really on a state-by-state basis, but the law from the Supreme Court is they have a right to counsel at the trial. When the court decides to make that happen is really dependent on the state. And I can't speak to other states, but I will tell you in New York State, a juvenile is entitled to an attorney at any point in the case, and they're advised of such. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the process. So our next player is the guardian ad litem, GLA. In some states, a court may appoint one. In New York, there is no guardian ad litem. It's the law guardian that plays this role, and this person is also an attorney. In other states, this person need not be an attorney, and it's generally seen that way. I think New Hampshire is one that has an individual called the guardian ad litem who gets appointed to sit with I wouldn't say represent, advocate. Let's use that word, advocate. You see it mostly in abuse, neglect, and dependency type cases and custody cases. They advocate on behalf of the child's best interest. They're usually appointed in delinquency cases if there's a need for treatment. But like I said, in New York, this isn't a separate person. This is the role of the law guardian, who is the attorney, and they act for the child. Court-appointed special advocates, these are volunteers. They don't get paid. They advise the court about child placement. These volunteers, they explore the needs of the child, and they offer a recommendation. In New York, this is usually done through social services. However, there are some programs that advocate on behalf of a child, depending on the type of case it is. And usually it's with a neglect or an abuse type case, and not so much in delinquency cases. Next set of players, we got the public defender services for children, but think of the public defender as the defense attorney. That's who a public defender is. And I mentioned earlier about appointing counsel. I'm going to expand on that right here. There are 3 ways to ensure that juveniles have a proper defense. There's a public defender program, and it's a county program of attorneys that defend individuals accused of crime or delinquent acts. This can be one agency. and they represent both children and both adults in criminal matters or delinquent matters. In bigger cities, New York City, so to speak, there's public defender's office, but they split, and there might be a separate agency or branch component that handles the defense of children. Also, another way that it's handled, and it depends on state to state, county to county, there's appointed private counsel, which means there's attorneys that work within the community, and the court appoints them to represent children. That's the way it is here in Clinton County. Even though Clinton County has a public defender's office now, they mainly represent adults in criminal court, and the family court system uses specially trained law guardians, is what they are. They're trained by the state, and they get appointed to represent children. Or there could be a combination of the two. So think of the public defender as the defense attorney for the child. Now we have the prosecutor. The prosecutor represents the interest of the state in bringing the case against a juvenile. In large areas with a large volume of juvenile cases, a prosecutor may handle only juvenile cases. In smaller places with fewer cases, a prosecutor might be responsible for both juvenile and adult cases. A prosecutor can be called the district attorney. That's usually what they're called for adult cases. County attorney, juvenile cases, unless transferred to an adult court, and then the DA handles. Could be called a state attorney, could be a United States attorney. If we're talking about a United States attorney, that's a federal court case. They don't come and step into cases at the state or county level. And in New York, the juvenile cases are handled by the county attorney unless the DA motions to and asks to be involved. Their key responsibilities, they have several. They ultimately make the decision on whether the case should be dismissed, adjudicated, and adjudicated means seek a conviction, or diverted, meaning handled another way. And we'll talk about these processes in a little bit more detail. And they have a wide range of discretion, and they have more discretion than the police do. They can decide what charges are going to be brought and ultimately sought. They decide any sort of plea bargain terms. They initiate the proceedings. They decide to seek removal to an adult court in some jurisdictions, and they handle the trial process. So they have a very big role, the prosecutor or the county attorney, depending on where you are. And then finally, we have the judge, the juvenile court judge. This is our central character in the juvenile court. Their primary responsibility is for the operation of the juvenile court and is an important decision maker in the court. They exercise considerable leadership in developing the juvenile justice system and the solutions involved. And they must ensure that necessary community resources are available. And unfortunately, this is not always favorable to the resource providers who have to work within parameters of the budget, but the judge has to ensure that there's resources available for the juveniles that come before it, which is a little unusual because normally judges aren't involved in that aspect or that component, certainly not in the adult court world. If services aren't available, then it's not an option. But judges play a role in trying to ensure that these things are in place. Juvenile court judge has duties relative to neglect and abuse cases against parents as well, or their guardians. But in the context of delinquent acts and crimes committed by the juveniles, their duties are a number of them. They make the rulings on any motions. They decide about continued detention of juveniles. If they've been taken into custody, judge will determine whether or not they remain there while the case is pending. They accept and reject any sort of negotiations or agreements that might be reached or plea bargaining. They handle the trials. They handle the rules of evidence and procedures. They guide how witnesses should be asked questions. They assume responsibility for holding the disposition hearing or the juvenile court version of a sentencing, what kind of punishment will get handed down. They handle any sort of requests or waiver proceedings to have a case transferred from juvenile court to an adult court. And they handle appeals when it's needed or when it's necessary. So the judge, big role in the courtroom. So those are our players that you generally see in the juvenile court process in the courtroom. There are certainly some other folks behind the scenes, probation and intake. We'll touch a little bit on those, but in the courtroom, those are the players. So next up, we're going to talk about the juvenile court process.